Hello, and thanks for tuning in today. My name's Professor Jim Flett Wilson, and I'm going to talk to you about the Viking Genes project. This is to mark the first anniversary since we launched a year ago. So we're going to start by going through the aims of the Viking II study. So what is it? What do we want to do? We want to recruit 4,000 volunteers with at least 2 grandparents from Orkney or from Shetland. Why do we want to do this? The reason is that we want to understand the genetic risk factors, so the inherited risk factors for common and rare diseases, many different diseases such as heart problems, diabetes, and so on. And the reason we want to do this is because it's the first stage to finding new treatments for these diseases. So how do we do that, you might ask? The key to this is by reading the DNA of our volunteers, we can see which genetic variants, pieces of DNA, are shared by people with particular risk factors or conditions. And that allows us to identify the genes that are important in these conditions. It's the first step on the journey to new drugs. So we've built up on our existing studies that many of you might have heard about, the Orkney Complex Disease Study, or ORCADES, and the Viking Health Study Shetland, or Viking. Between these two studies, we've recruited over 4,000 volunteers since we began in March 2005, more than 15 years ago now. And it's actually amazing when I counted them up yesterday, because these studies have contributed to 232 peer-reviewed publications, so scientific papers in the literature, and counting. There are more in preparation. So it actually makes ORCADES the 4th equal most studied cohort in the whole of the UK for genetic association studies. Now that's the main way of finding new genes. And indeed, it's actually 17th most studied in the entire world. And if you're interested to read about some of those papers, a few of them from time to time are highlighted on our website at ed.ac.uk/Viking. You can read more there. So back to the launch. As I said, this happened about a year ago in January 2020. I gave a public lecture in Kirkwall, and the following night another one in Lerwick, and you can see me here in the picture giving this talk. We had full houses on both occasions, and in Shetland this was actually videoed and put up on YouTube, where we have over 1,200 views now. We also benefited from excellent coverage in local and national newspapers, and Rachel's done a sterling job with the social media in the meantime. So we're off to an absolutely fantastic start and had a very large number of volunteers. But as you'll all be aware, 2020 was not a year like any other that I've seen, or indeed anyone else, because of course we were hit with the global COVID-19 pandemic, particularly beginning in Britain in March, and subsequent lockdowns. This meant we had to pause our saliva kit sampling and also the processing of that saliva for DNA, because the lab had to prioritize COVID projects, and we decided to redeploy some of the team to COVID research. We actually set up a new study called Corona Genes. This was a project which sought to identify the genetic factors influencing COVID susceptibility and severity and symptoms. So you'll all be aware that many people pass COVID without having any symptoms at all, yet others end up on ventilators in intensive care. And there's now strong evidence that there are genetic factors that influence these outcomes. The study built enormously on Viking II infrastructure and protocols, which allowed us to set it up quite quickly, and was very successful. We recruited 15,000 or so consented individuals. The analysis and indeed the fundraising to continue this are still very much ongoing. So back to Viking II, we were able later in the summer to return to our Viking II work. And as you can see here in these totals, we're well on the way to our target of 4,000. We have over 3,700 people have consented, over 3,100 have completed their questionnaire, and over 2,600 have returned their samples. So you'll see that at each stage there's a gap. There are people who have completed their questionnaire but have not yet returned their spit kit. There are people who have consented to our study but have not yet completed their questionnaire. and there are many people who registered but have not consented. But in any way of looking at it, we're doing extremely well, and quite soon, I hope, we'll start getting into our target, which of course is to have 4,000 people who are completed and have their samples returned. Now, because this is an online questionnaire, we're able to recruit people from anywhere in the world and take advantage of the large diaspora of Orcadians and Shetlanders. And you can see here, they're concentrated, of course, in Britain, but also in her former colonies. But we have people from all over the place, from Honolulu in Hawaii to Anchorage in Alaska, from Cape Town in South Africa to Hong Kong. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit on some of these now. Here we have the Antipodes. You can see there's a scattering of people in Australia, but many more in New Zealand, particularly in the South Island. I want to draw your attention here to the different coloured map pins. The blue pins are people who have 2 grandparents from Orkney or Shetland. So typically one of their parents comes from there. The red pins, all of their grandparents are from Orkney or Shetland. So typically they come from there. So you can see the previous generation moving out and the present generation moving out. This is very clear here when we look in Canada. There are very many people there who have a parent from Orkney or Shetland. They're not scattered equally across the continent. We have a large concentration in Saskatchewan and in the prairies. There's also smaller concentrations in British Columbia around Vancouver and in Ontario around Toronto. Here in Europe, we have a lighter scattering of people, but nevertheless, there are people of Northern Isles descent from Malaga to Trondheim, from Ancona to Helsinki. When we zoom in to Britain now, this may come as something of a surprise that there are so many people in the Orcadian and Shetlandic diaspora who live in England. The whole country, from top to bottom, from east to west, seems to be full of immigrants. There are many fewer in Ireland, however. Moving now to Scotland, we see ever increasing concentrations, mostly scattered out and living where most people in Scotland live today, but also you see some all the way west in the Hebrides, in Skye and in Mull. When we look at the Central Belt, there are diasporan Orcadians and Shetlanders all the way from Helensburgh to Dunbar, but with a huge concentration in Edinburgh. Also in the northeast of Scotland, we see these concentrations in Aberdeen and also in Inverness. But of course, it's on the home islands where we see the strongest concentration, and you'll see now that the colour of the map pins has in general changed. Most people here have a red map pin, and so have all 4 grandparents from the Northern Isles. Zooming in now to Orkney, we can see that there are concentrations in Kirkwall and in Stromness. I want to point out that the lack of volunteers from some of the Northern Isles might be because of the ORCADES study vehicle, which went around Westray, Sandy, Stronsay and Shappensea for between 1 and 6 months, and so recruited a very large number of people there into the ORCADES study, who therefore will not be eligible to join the VIKING II study. But it is true that some of the other islands who have very little volunteers that we'd like to have more from. We've got very few people from North Ronaldsay, from Adie, from Rousey and also from Hoy. Looking now to Shetland, we see a similar picture. There are volunteers from Sumborough in the south to Burrowfirth in Unst in the north. We again have concentrations where people live, in Lerwick, in Sannock, in Scallowa, in Bray. We also have very large numbers of volunteers from Whalsa and from Burgh Isle. There are also places where we have no one from as yet. So we've got nobody from the Skerries, from Fulla or from Papa, and very few indeed from Fetler. So we're always looking for more people. When we sum up by area, we see that presently Orkney is just pipping Shetland to the post, being 11 people ahead. So I don't know if there's any Shetlanders out there who'd like to redress this balance. We also have very strong representation in Lothian and Grampian and in other parts of Scotland. Now, when we go in and look to see how many grandparents each volunteer has from Orkney or Shetland, we see that actually having 4 grandparents from the Northern Isles is the most common situation, with nearly half our volunteers being of full heritage. The next most common is to have 2 grandparents from Orkney or Shetland, so just a little under 40%, and it's considerably rarer to have 3 grandparents from the Northern Isles. Now, let's have a little look into who we've recruited. We have a very broad range of ages in our study, going from 16 all the way up to 101. So we have years of birth from 1919 all the way through to 2004. The mean age, however, is 52, which means a mean year of birth of 1968. We can see a nice distribution here. Many people born in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. This is a very typical distribution for a volunteer study. And the male-female ratio is also typical. Women are much better than men at coming forward for research. So 62% female, 38% male. And we'd be very interested to try to increase the number of male volunteers in our study. So I've looked a little bit at some of the questionnaire responses just to get an overview. The first thing I looked at was eye color. And we can see here that people in our study, about 16% have brown eyes, about a quarter have green or hazel eyes, but the great majority, at 59%, have blue or grey eyes. And when we compare this to data from Britain and Ireland, we can see that across Britain and Ireland, 48%, just under half, have blue eyes, 30% have green eyes, and 22% have brown eyes. So we compare this to the Viking II cohort, we see there's a considerable increase in the number of people with blue or grey eyes at the expense of having brown or green and hazel eyes. Eye colours under very strong genetic control, mostly controlled by one variant in one gene. And I've put in here a map across Europe showing where blue eyes are most common. You can see it really has expanded out from around the Baltic Sea. It's also common famously in Scandinavia. And there's probably no doubt that the slightly increased frequency of blue eyes in the people of Orkney and Shetland was to do with their Viking heritage. What about hair colour now? We can see that the majority of people have dark brown hair. The most common colour is dark brown at about 40%. There's also a large proportion, 37%, with dark blonde or light brown hair, and then smaller fractions with different colours such as black, red, strawberry blonde, and light blonde. This is also genetic, but it involves many more genes than eye colour. But like eye colour, it's unusually variable across Europe. Europeans are unusually diverse in their pigmentation compared to other people across the globe. But even within the British Isles, this colouring varies. Here I've shown a map from earlier research of mine looking at the predicted frequency of red hair across Britain and Ireland. And you can see that, contrary to what many people might think, that the place with the highest frequency of red hair is predicted to be the southeast of Scotland. But in fact, the pattern is that most of Scotland, the north of England, Wales and Ireland all have substantial numbers of redheads. And it's the south and centre of England and the very north and west of Scotland that has many fewer redheads. And I'm quite convinced this is because of a dilution of the original indigenous people of Britain and Ireland, who obviously had quite a lot of red hair, and they've been diluted out in the south by the Saxons and the Angles, and in the far north and the far northwest by the Vikings, bringing down the proportion of red hair in those places below the level seen in the rest of the British Isles and Ireland. Now, I wanted to briefly touch on musicality, because folk music's such a strong tradition in Orkney and particularly in Shetland. I put in a couple of pictures here of some of our famous musicians, Ali Bain there, and my cousins Chris Stute and Kevin Henderson. So we asked people in the cohort if they could carry a tune. 64% said they could, 2/3 or so, and 54% said they could sing back a note if it were played to them. 31%, nearly 1/3, played an instrument, and 6% claimed to have perfect pitch, to be able to name a note that is played to them. This is dramatically higher than in other surveys where it's considerably below 1%. So it does seem that there may be an increased musicality here. I believe this is probably genetic, and we're going to look into it. I actually have pulled up some old photographs for you, which speak to this. Here on the right is a picture of my grandfather, Jimmy Wilson, playing the accordion with his cousin Hannah. This is actually taken on the 12th May 1937, Coronation Day, and they have Captain Ted Fresson, the famous aviator, in between them. On the left here is my granduncle and Chris Stoot's granduncle, Andy Junsen, playing the fiddle, and next to him is Hannah's brother, Bob. And it's funny to me that Andy is actually Chris Stoot's granduncle, and Hannah and Bob are Kevin Henderson's great-granduncle and auntie. So we're perhaps seeing a little bit of genetics going on in the Fair Isle families with who plays an instrument. It skipped me for some reason in any case. Now, let's have a look at what people like to eat. We have a large program in Edinburgh looking at the genetics of food preferences. So I'm going to show these data on a simple scale from 1 to 9, where 1 is that you extremely dislike this food, and 9 is that you extremely like it. So there's a scale going from I don't like it to I really like it. And we're showing the data here for coalfish. So this was a very common food in the old times in Orkney and Shetland. People in Shetland call them piltocks, and people in Orkney call them cooths or sillocks if they're younger. And I'm not sure what our ancestors would think, because it appears now that if I add together 1, 2, and 3, about 40% of us dislike coalfish, and only a small proportion actually like it. And I think this is funny and interesting to compare to something like avocado, something our ancestors wouldn't have had very much of, I don't imagine. And we can see here it's almost the opposite pattern, where 51%, if I add up 7, 8, and 9, like avocado, and only a small number dislike it. But we shouldn't worry, we can still be certain that we're related to the Scots, because when I ask the same question about haggis, I see that unbelievably 61% of people like haggis, and only about 10% extremely dislike it. So all is okay at the end. Let's have a look at the surnames of the people who've joined the Viking II study. And we see the surname Sinclair, formerly the name of the Earls of Orkney, who also ruled Shetland and Caithness, is the top here. And I believe it is the most common name in Orkney and very common also in Shetland. And indeed, that's a pattern. Some of these names that are so frequent here are names that are found in both archipelagos. Names like Tullach, let's see here, Tate, Spence. These are names found in both places. But we also have some names that are rather more specific. Flet is an Orkney name, Drever is an Orkney name, and so on. I don't know if you can see your name there in the top 40. We can look within the Viking II participants, zooming in on those who live in Orkney. And we can then compare that to the volunteers for the ORCADES study over 10 years ago. We can see lots of Orkney surnames here: Sinclair, Flet, Spence, Harkis, and so on. But what's interesting is that in the ORCADES study, because of its focus initially on the North Isles of Orkney, we see a slightly different list of surnames. Many of them are from the North Isles. Rendell, Drever, Harkis, and so on are Westry surnames. Thompson and Muir are very common in North Ronaldsay, for instance. And then names like Scherer and Miller are Stronsay surnames. What's also interesting is I found a list of how commonly surnames were mentioned in documents from the 17th century. And so we can see the continuity of surnames here. Sinclair is also the most common name, and Spence and Flet are also on the list. But while the others are still found in Orkney, names like Linklater and Craigie and Lutet are still there, they're not as common as they were, and it shows how some families have expanded and others have contracted, or maybe many of them emigrated to somewhere else. We can now look at some maps that I've taken from Gregor Lamb's book from 1980 on Orkney surnames, and you can see here how focused certain surnames are to given isles or parishes. Here's Rendell, that many of you will know is very concentrated in Papa Westry, Pappy, and in Westry. Here we have a map for Flet, a name that originated in Harry and is still found there today, and also in Bursey, just next door. But here's a contrast. This is the map for Sinclair, and you can see it's found much more spread over most of the parts of Orkney. Although there are concentrations in Sandy and Strumness and Shappensea, for instance, it's a very widespread name. We can now do the same for Shetland. We can look at the Viking II participants who live in Shetland, and we see many, many Shetland surnames coming up, Anderson being the most frequent. And we can again compare that to the Viking Health Study Shetland from 5 or more years ago. And this time we see a rather similar list of surnames. What's very notable to me is just how many patronymics they are. Anderson, Johnson, Jameson, Williamson, Robertson, Simpson, Nicholson, Lawrenson, Manson, Sanderson. Every name nearly is a patronymic, showing this Norse naming pattern that actually only ended in Shetland about 200 and a little bit years ago. We can compare actually the frequency of surnames to those times, comparing to lists of names from 1804. And here we see very, very strong continuity. The list of names from 1804 is very similar to the most common names that we see in our volunteers today. So we're now in 2021. We all hope that'll be a rather better year than 2020 was. We're going to continue to recruit people into Viking II up to 4,000 and beyond if more people volunteer in time. We're going to start the process of gathering email addresses from our old participants in ORCADES, so that we can then allow ORCADES and Viking I participants to complete our new questionnaire, and also so that if they are interested, they can consent to the return of important genetic findings, which they have not consented to thus far. We're going to be continuing many different analyses and annotations of our ORCADES and Viking data. We're very excited because we hope to get so-called proteomics measured, 7,000 proteins in a large subset of the ORCADES volunteers. So that will allow us to do all sorts of clever analyses. And we're also making plans for blood draws for the Viking II volunteers who live in the vicinity of Edinburgh and also in the Northern Isles, where we'll also be planning to resample willing ORCADES and Viking volunteers at some point in 2022. So we're going to be keeping ourselves very busy. This is the time where I want to encourage anyone listening to sign up if they haven't already done so, and particularly to tell your granddad, tell your uncle, tell your father, your brothers, your sons, your nephews, your grandsons, that this is an interesting project and they should consider taking part in it, because we have too few men so far, and it's important that we have as many men as we can. If you're someone who's consented to the study but not quite managed to find the time to complete the questionnaire, there's no time like the present. And if you've not yet returned your spit kit, the lab are still booking them in during this lockdown, so it's okay to pop them in the post and we will get them and they'll be processed in due course. It only remains for me to thank you for listening, and thanks very much to the Viking Genes team, Rachel Edwards, David Buchanan and Shona Kerr, pictured here with me in Edinburgh. But most of all, I want to thank all the volunteers. Thank you so much for your time and for your trust and for your DNA. If you want to join up, simply go to www.ed.ac.uk/Viking, where you can find out how to do it, and you can follow us at our social media handles shown here as well, at Viking Gene or Viking Genes. Thank you very much.